In the dim centuries following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, when Europe seemed to fall into a long, uncertain twilight, a strange dynasty rose quietly in the lands that would one day be called France. To most history books, the Merovingians are little more than a footnote. Early barbarian kings, half-pagan, half-Christian, ruling crude territories before being replaced by more capable rulers. Yet beneath this simplified narrative lies a far deeper and more unsettling story. A story filled with silences, erased names, forbidden bloodlines, and secrets powerful enough to be buried for more than 1,000 years. Imagine the Frankish world of the 5th and 6th centuries. Forests still dominated the landscape. Roman roads lay broken, but not forgotten. Old gods lingered in whispers, even as Christianity spread through monasteries and royal courts. This was not an age of clarity, it was an age of transition. And it is precisely in such ages that hidden power thrives. The Merovingians emerged during this liminal moment, not merely as warriors or kings, but as figures surrounded by ritual, symbolism, and myth in ways that set them apart from every dynasty that followed. Their founder, Clovis I, is remembered for uniting the Frankish tribes and converting to Christianity. Officially, his baptism marks the birth of Christian France. But even this event, celebrated by the Church, carries strange undertones. Clovis' conversion was not the quiet spiritual awakening of a humble king. It was a political and mystical spectacle surrounded by visions, divine signs, and miraculous interventions. Chroniclers speak of heavenly guidance, sacred oil descending from the sky, and a sense that Clovis' authority came not merely from conquest, but from something far older and far more mysterious. From the very beginning, the Merovingians ruled differently. They were not crowned in the Roman sense. Their legitimacy did not rely on law, senate, or imperial decree. Instead, it flowed through blood. The king was sacred not because he governed, but because he was. His body itself carried authority. This idea, alien to modern thinking, echoes ancient traditions of sacral kingship found in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Near East. The Merovingian king was believed to stand at the crossroads between the human and the divine, a living vessel of continuity stretching back into mythic time. One of the most curious symbols of this belief was hair. Merovingian kings were known as the long-haired kings, and this was no mere fashion. Their hair was never cut, for it was believed to hold power, memory, and legitimacy. To cut a Merovingian's hair was to strip him of his right to rule. In a world where kingship was normally tied to strength or inheritance, this belief seems almost ritualistic, shamanic, even. Hair as a conduit of power appears in ancient Nazarite traditions, in Samson's biblical story, and in priestly cults across the ancient world. The question is unavoidable. Where did the Merovingians inherit this belief? As centuries passed, chroniclers began to hint, quietly, at something unsettling. The Merovingians were said to possess a different nature than ordinary men. Some legends claimed they descended from a sea creature, a quinator, born of a mystical union between a queen and a being not entirely human. To modern readers, such stories sound like myth-making. But in the ancient world, myths were rarely invented without purpose. They encoded truths too dangerous, too complex, or too sacred to speak plainly. What if these legends were not meant to be believed literally, but symbolically? What if they were pointing toward a lineage that originated outside the known Roman Christian world, a bloodline carrying traditions, teachings, or authority that predated Europe itself? As Christianity tightened its grip on Western Europe, it also tightened control over history. Records were copied, edited, destroyed, or quietly reinterpreted. The Merovingians, once described in reverent tones, slowly began to be portrayed as weak, decadent, and unfit to rule. Later historians labeled them Roisphanians, do-nothing kings. Yet this sudden shift in reputation raises an uncomfortable question. Were they truly incompetent rulers, or had they become inconvenient ones? Because while the Merovingians appeared to lose political power, something else was happening beneath the surface. Administrative control shifted to figures known as the mayors of the palace, men who ruled in practice while the kings ruled in name. This arrangement is often explained as a natural evolution of governance. But alternative historians see something far more deliberate, a slow containment of a dangerous bloodline, a way to neutralize sacred kings without provoking rebellion, martyrdom, or mythic backlash. Silence begins to creep into the records at this point. Names vanish, lineages blur. Entire generations seem to dissolve into monastic life or obscurity. Unlike other overthrown dynasties, the Merovingians were not publicly exterminated. There were no mass executions, no dramatic final stand. Instead, there is absence. And absence, in history, is often more telling than presence. Why would a ruling dynasty simply fade away? To understand this, one must look not at what medieval writers said, but at what they refused to say. In a time when chroniclers recorded omens, miracles, and minor court scandals in obsessive detail, the disappearance of an entire sacred lineage without explanation is extraordinary. It suggests control. It suggests fear. It suggests knowledge that could not be allowed to circulate freely. Some theories propose that the Merovingians were guardians of forbidden teachings, early Christian doctrines deemed heretical by Rome. Others argue they carried bloodline claims linked to Jerusalem, to Davidic kingship, or to esoteric interpretations of Christ's legacy. Still others believe they held ancient maps, relics, or cosmological knowledge inherited through Eastern traditions long before the rise of the papacy. What makes these theories so persistent is not that they rely on wild imagination, but that they align disturbingly well with the pattern of suppression that follows. Wherever Merovingian influence once reached, later powers rewrote the narrative. Churches were rededicated. Symbols were altered. Pagan Christian hybrids were erased in favor of rigid orthodoxy. The world was being simplified, standardized, and anything that resisted this process was quietly removed. Yet secrets, once created, are rarely destroyed. They migrate. They adapt. They find refuge. This documentary begins with a simple but unsettling premise, that the Merovingians did not simply lose power. They chose disappearance over destruction. That beneath the Frankish crown lay a secret too dangerous to exist in plain sight. And that when the time came, this secret did not die with the dynasty, but was carried eastward, away from Rome, away from the papacy, into lands where memory could survive without persecution. To follow this trail requires abandoning the comfort of official timelines and stepping into the shadows between recorded events. It requires listening to whispers rather than proclamations. Because history, especially sacred history, is rarely written by those who guard its deepest truths. And so, as the Frankish crown passes from sacred kings to sanctioned rulers, as monasteries grow silent and bloodlines blur, we are left standing at the edge of a great historical void. A silence that invites questions. A silence that suggests movement. A silence that hints not at an ending, but at a journey just beginning. To understand the Merovingians, one must learn to read a language that is no longer spoken openly, a language of symbols, rituals, and unspoken meanings. This was not a dynasty that ruled through laws written on parchment or decrees carved in stone. Their authority was expressed through signs that modern historians often dismiss as superstition. Yet in the ancient world, symbols were not decoration. They were instruction. They were memory. And for the Merovingians, symbols were power. Among all these symbols, none is more striking or more misunderstood than their hair. The long hair of Merovingian kings was not merely a cultural trait or tribal tradition. It was sacred. Chroniclers describe it with reverence, noting that the king's hair was never cut from birth to death. When a Merovingian prince was captured or deposed, his hair was shorn before he was sent into exile or a monastery. This single act was considered sufficient to end his claim to the throne. No execution was required. No trial. The power was believed to leave him the moment the hair fell. This belief places the Merovingians in a much older spiritual framework than medieval Europe is usually granted. Hair as a vessel of divine authority appears across ancient civilizations. In the Hebrew tradition, the Nazarites were forbidden to cut their hair as a sign of dedication to God. Samson's strength was not metaphorical. It was believed to reside literally in his uncut hair. In ancient Egypt, priest-kings wore ceremonial hairpieces symbolizing cosmic order. Even in early Indo-European shamanic cultures, hair was seen as a conduit between the physical body and the unseen world. The Merovingians did not invent this symbolism. They inherited it. This inheritance suggests continuity, an unbroken line of tradition reaching back beyond the fall of Rome, beyond Christianity itself. While other Germanic rulers adopted Roman titles, clothing, and administrative systems, the Merovingians retained something far older. They did not fully Romanize, nor did they entirely Christianize their kingship. Instead, they stood at an intersection, blending Christian legitimacy with pre-Christian sacral authority. This uneasy balance made them dangerous. Their seals and insignia reinforced this impression. Bees, fleur-de-lis, like forms, solar wheels, and flowing organic patterns appear repeatedly in Merovingian artifacts. The bee, in particular, appears long before it becomes a symbol of later French monarchs. In ancient symbolism, the bee represented immortality, divine order, and sacred kingship. In Egypt, bees were associated with the pharaoh and the soul's journey after death. In Greek mystery cults, initiates were sometimes called bees, keepers of sacred knowledge. Why would a supposedly barbarian dynasty adopt such symbols? Because they were not adopting them. They were preserving them. The Merovingian king was not merely a ruler. He was a living symbol. His body was a text to be read. His hair, his lineage, his presence all conveyed meaning to those who understood the code. Even the act of kingship itself was ritualized. Royal assemblies were not just political gatherings. They were ceremonial reaffirmations of cosmic order. The king's role was to maintain balance between heaven and earth, between past and future. This idea clashes violently with the emerging power of the Church. Christianity, especially in its Roman form, sought to relocate sacred authority away from bloodlines and into institutions. Power would flow from God to church, and from church to king. The Merovingian model reversed this logic. Authority flowed through the king's blood first. The church could bless him, but it could not replace him. This fundamental contradiction created tension that simmered for centuries beneath the surface of Frankish politics. It is no coincidence that Merovingian kings were often portrayed as mystical, passive, or withdrawn in later sources. These descriptions serve a purpose. A king who does not actively rule can be dismissed. A king whose power is symbolic can be sidelined. But symbolism does not mean weakness. In many ancient societies, symbolic authority was the highest form of power because it shaped belief, loyalty, and identity. Another overlooked element of Merovingian symbolism lies in their connection to water. Founding legends speak of sea origins, river crossings, and liminal births near sacred waters. Water, in esoteric traditions, represents transition, memory, and the boundary between worlds. Baptism itself is a transformation through water, a concept that Christianity inherited rather than invented. By embedding water symbolism into their origin myths, the Merovingians aligned themselves with rebirth and continuity rather than conquest. This symbolic language extended even into geography. Merovingian centers of power often coincided with ancient sacred sites, places of earlier worship, ley lines, or natural convergence points. Rather than erase pagan significance, they absorbed it. Churches were built atop older sanctuaries, not to destroy their meaning, but to redirect it. This approach stands in stark contrast to later Christian rulers, who sought to purify and standardize sacred space. To those who could read these signs, the message was clear. The Merovingians were custodians, not innovators. They guarded something inherited, something fragile, something that could not survive open confrontation with an increasingly rigid church hierarchy. As time passed, this symbolic language became dangerous. Symbols invite interpretation. Interpretation invites questions, and questions threaten authority. By the 7th century, the church had little patience for ambiguity. Doctrine hardened. Heresies were named and hunted. Sacred kingship without papal mediation became unacceptable. So the symbols were slowly stripped of meaning. Hair became a curiosity. Bees became decoration. Sacred kings became lazy kings. The language was not destroyed. It was translated into ridicule. This is one of the most effective methods of suppression. What cannot be openly condemned is often trivialized until it no longer inspires loyalty or fear. Yet symbols have memory. Even when misunderstood, they persist. Centuries later, fragments of Merovingian symbolism would resurface in unexpected places, in knightly orders, in royal iconography, in whispered legends of sacred bloodlines. These echoes suggest that the language was never fully lost, only submerged, passed quietly from initiate to initiate, from family to family, from east to west. This section of the story reveals a crucial truth. The Merovingians were not overthrown because they failed politically. They were sidelined because their symbolic authority represented an older, incompatible worldview, one in which power flowed through lineage, ritual, and cosmic alignment rather than paperwork and permission. Understanding this prepares us for what comes next. Because when a dynasty built on symbols disappears, it rarely does so by accident. Symbols do not vanish, they travel, and those who carry them know exactly where they must go to survive. To speak of the Merovingian bloodline is to step into territory where history, legend, and deliberate silence overlap. This is the point where conventional scholarship often retreats, uncomfortable with questions that cannot be neatly footnoted. It is also the point where the Merovingian mystery truly begins. Because the deeper one looks into their claimed origins, the clearer it becomes that this dynasty was never meant to be understood as merely Frankish, Germanic, or even European. The Merovingians presented themselves, quietly, persistently, as inheritors of something far older than Rome itself. Early medieval sources hint at this without fully explaining it. They speak of ancestors who arrived from distant lands, of noble lines that existed before the Franks crossed the Rhine, before Rome conquered Gaul, before Christianity reshaped Europe. These are not the kinds of claims a dynasty invents lightly. In the ancient world, lineage was credibility. To fabricate a false ancestry was to invite divine punishment and political collapse. Yet the Merovingians insisted on antiquity, even when doing so set them apart from their contemporaries. One of the most persistent threads connects the Merovingians to Troy. Medieval genealogies trace their line back to Trojan refugees who fled the burning city and wandered west, eventually settling in Europe. Modern historians often dismiss this as a fashionable myth, noting that Romans themselves claimed Trojan descent through Aeneas. But this dismissal overlooks something important. Trojan origin myths were not merely about prestige. They were about survival. Troy represented the idea of an ancient world destroyed by betrayal and preserved only through bloodlines that escaped. To claim Trojan descent was to claim continuity from a pre-classical civilization, one that existed before Greek philosophy, before Roman law, before imperial Christianity. It was to place one's lineage outside the control of later institutions. In this sense, the Merovingian Trojan claim is less about imitation and more about alignment with a tradition of exile and preservation. Other traditions push the bloodline even further east. Some alternative genealogies link the Merovingians to Scythian or Parthian nobility, rider culture from the Eurasian steppes who interacted with Persia, India, and the Near East long before Europe emerged as a political entity. These cultures practiced sacral kingship, solar symbolism, and hereditary spiritual authority. Kings were not elected or crowned by priests. They were recognized as manifestations of cosmic order. The parallels to Merovingian kingship are striking and difficult to ignore. Then there's the most controversial claim of all, a Near Eastern, possibly Judaic or early Christian lineage tied to Jerusalem. According to suppressed traditions and later esoteric writings, the Merovingians were not simply Christian converts, but inheritors of a bloodline associated with the earliest followers of Christ. Not the institutional church that would emerge centuries later, but the original movement rooted in Jewish mysticism, messianic kingship, and familial succession. In this framework, Christ is not merely a spiritual figure, but a legitimate royal claimant, and his lineage, whether literal or symbolic, continues through carefully protected bloodlines. This idea, explosive even today, would have been unthinkable to openly preserve in medieval Europe. The Church's authority depended on Christ's uniqueness and spiritual transcendence. A bloodline implied continuity. Continuity implied rivals. Whether or not one accepts these claims literally, their persistence demands explanation. They did not arise in isolation. They appear in Gnostic traditions, in Eastern Christian sects, in medieval Grail romances, and later in Renaissance esoteric circles. The Merovingians sit at the center of this web, repeatedly named as carriers of sacred legitimacy that predates papal sanction. What is especially revealing is how aggressively later powers sought to discredit this bloodline. By the time Carolingian historians rewrote Frankish history, Merovingian origins were deliberately blurred. Genealogies were shortened. Mythic elements were exaggerated into ridicule. What had once been presented as sacred ancestry was reframed as absurd legend. This was not accidental. It was a method. By turning ancient claims into fairy tales, their threat could be neutralized without direct confrontation. Yet, blood remembers even when records forget. The Merovingians practiced strict endogamy within elite circles, reinforcing the idea that blood itself mattered more than territory. Royal marriages were not random political alliances. They were carefully chosen unions that preserved lineage purity. This practice echoes priestly castes and royal houses of the ancient Near East far more than it does early medieval Europe. It suggests a consciousness of descent that went beyond immediate political needs. There's also the matter of physical descriptions. Chroniclers occasionally describe Merovingian kings as possessing unusual features, striking eyes, commanding presence, an almost otherworldly charisma. While such descriptions could be literary embellishment, they also reflect how these kings were perceived, not merely as rulers, but as beings set apart, chosen, different. This perception mattered. In societies where literacy was rare, authority was not enforced through documents, but through belief. If people believed a king's blood carried divine legitimacy, rebellion became sacrilege. This kind of power was far more difficult for institutions like the Church to control. As Christianity became more centralized, bloodline-based authority became increasingly dangerous. The Church could excommunicate a king, but it could not erase belief in sacred descent overnight. The solution was gradual displacement. The bloodline would not be destroyed, it would be rendered irrelevant. Or so it seemed. What complicates this narrative is the absence of a clear ending. No definitive moment exists when the Merovingian bloodline is declared extinct. Instead, it fades from official records while continuing to appear in peripheral sources, local legends, noble family trees, and later esoteric traditions. This pattern suggests not extinction, but migration. If the bloodline could no longer survive openly in Western Europe, it would seek refuge elsewhere. The East offered possibilities the West did not. In Byzantium, royal bloodlines intermingled freely with ancient traditions. In Armenia and Georgia, kingship remained deeply tied to sacred descent. In Persia, lineage and cosmology were inseparable. These regions did not require a king's authority to be validated by Rome. Seen through this lens, the Merovingian bloodline appears less like a failed European dynasty and more like a remnant of an older world order, one incompatible with emerging Western structures. A lineage that understood when to rule and when to disappear. This reframing changes everything. It suggests that the Merovingians were not clinging to power as it slipped away. They were protecting something more valuable than a throne, something that could survive loss of territory but not loss of blood. And if that is true, then the story of the Merovingians does not end with their removal from the Frankish crown. It merely leaves the spotlight. The bloodline, like a river diverted underground, continues to flow, silent, hidden, and waiting for a moment when it might surface again. With this understanding, the question is no longer whether the Merovingians fell. The question becomes far more unsettling. Where did a bloodline older than Rome go when Europe was no longer safe to hold its memory? The story of Dagobert II marks the moment when the Merovingian mystery stops being subtle and becomes unmistakably deliberate. Before him, the dynasty's secrets were hidden in symbols, myths, and ritual. After him, they are hidden in silence. Not poetic silence, but the kind that appears when something has been forcibly removed from the record. Dagobert II is not merely a king who was assassinated. He is a king whose death created a void so precise, so controlled, that it reshaped the future of Europe. Dagobert II was born into a world already turning against his bloodline. By the mid-7th century, the Merovingians still sat on the throne, but their real power had been hollowed out. The mayors of the palace governed in practice, while kings reigned in appearance. To most observers, this seemed like a natural political evolution. But to those who understood sacred kingship, it was something else entirely: containment. Dagobert was the son of Sigebert III, one of the last Merovingian kings to exercise genuine authority. When Sigebert died, Dagobert was still a child. In a move that would later prove critical, the young prince was quietly removed from the Frankish court and sent to an Irish monastery. Officially, this was for his protection. Unofficially, it was an exile disguised as education. Ireland, at the time, lay outside direct Roman control and preserved forms of Christianity that were deeply mystical, symbolic, and resistant to papal authority. This was not a random destination. Years passed. Dagobert grew into adulthood far from the politics of Francia, absorbing a worldview that blended Christianity with ancient cosmology and sacred kingship. When he finally returned to reclaim his throne, he was not merely a political claimant. He was a fully formed embodiment of the old Merovingian ideal, a sacred king shaped outside Rome's influence. His return should have been impossible. Yet somehow, against the interests of powerful men, Dagobert II was restored to the throne of Austrasia. This alone suggests that significant factions still believed in the legitimacy of his bloodline. For a brief moment, it appeared as though the Merovingians might reassert themselves, not as figureheads, but as true rulers once more. That moment did not last. Dagobert II ruled for only a few years before being assassinated in 679. The official explanation is vague, offering little more than the claim that he was killed during a hunting expedition. No trial, no public reckoning, no divine punishment recorded for the perpetrators. For a king whose blood was believed to be sacred, this absence of ritual response is extraordinary. Even more extraordinary is what followed. After Dagobert's death, the historical record fractures. Mentions of his lineage become inconsistent, contradictory, or vanish altogether. His supposed heirs disappear from clear documentation. Some sources claim his son died young. Others suggest his line ended entirely. Yet none provide convincing evidence. In an era obsessed with genealogy, especially royal genealogy, such uncertainty is deeply suspicious. This is what scholars call the First Great Silence. It is not that nothing happened after Dagobert II. It is that whatever happened was not allowed to be written plainly. Chroniclers who meticulously recorded battles, miracles, and minor court intrigues suddenly become evasive. Names are omitted. Dates blur. Language becomes imprecise. This is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of restraint. To understand why Dagobert II was so dangerous, one must consider what he represented. He was a legitimate Merovingian king who had not been molded by Frankish political machinery or Roman ecclesiastical control. His authority did not flow through the church. It flowed through blood, tradition, and symbolic legitimacy that predated papal approval. This made him unpredictable and uncontrollable. From the church's perspective, Dagobert was a problem that could not be solved through excommunication alone. Removing him publicly would risk reinforcing belief in his sacred status. Martyring a sacred king would only strengthen the myth. The solution had to be quiet, deniable, and final. Assassination accomplished this, but only partially. Killing Dagobert removed the man, but not the bloodline. And bloodlines do not disappear unless they are either exterminated or relocated. There is no credible evidence of mass execution following his death. No purges, no public eradication of relatives. Instead, we see dispersal, fragmentation, silence. Some traditions claim Dagobert's descendants were absorbed into noble families, their identity concealed. Others suggest they were sent east, beyond the reach of Frankish chroniclers. What unites these theories is the recognition that something was being protected, not destroyed. The church would later canonize Dagobert II as a saint. On the surface, this appears contradictory. Why sanctify a king who represented a dangerous lineage? But canonization can be a form of control. By framing Dagobert as a holy but harmless figure of the past, his political and bloodline significance could be neutralized. He becomes an object of veneration rather than continuity. This transformation, from sacred king to isolated saint, is one of the most effective historical erasures imaginable. Saints do not have heirs. Saints do not pass on authority. Saints exist outside time. By sanctifying Dagobert, the church effectively removed him from the dynastic equation. His bloodline could be dismissed as irrelevant, even if it continued elsewhere. Yet echoes of resistance remain. Later medieval traditions speak of a hidden line descending from Dagobert II, preserved in secrecy. These traditions surface centuries later in unexpected contexts, in Grail lore, in coded genealogies, in whispers of a lost king whose return would restore balance. Whether literal or symbolic, these stories reveal that Dagobert's death was never fully accepted as an ending. It was perceived as an interruption. The idea that a rightful king was removed unjustly creates a powerful narrative vacuum. Into that vacuum flow legends of exile, concealment, and eventual return. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history, from Arthurian myth to messianic traditions across cultures. Dagobert II fits this archetype too perfectly to be coincidence. What makes his case unique is how early and how effectively the silence was imposed. By the time later dynasties consolidated power, the Merovingian threat had already been mythologized into obscurity. The silence had done its work. But silence does not mean absence. It means displacement. Dagobert II's assassination marks the moment when the Merovingian story stops unfolding openly in Western Europe and begins moving elsewhere, into marginal spaces, foreign lands, and protected traditions. His death is not the end of the dynasty, but the moment it passes beyond the reach of conventional history. From this point forward, we are no longer dealing with a visible royal house. We're dealing with shadows, with fragments, with a lineage that has learned the cost of visibility. And it is precisely here, in this carefully engineered silence, that the idea of an Eastern Exodus first begins to make sense. By the time Dagobert II vanished from the stage of history, the machinery that would replace the Merovingian kings was already firmly in motion. It did not arrive with banners, battles, or public declarations. Instead, it crept forward quietly, embedding itself within the royal court while allowing the illusion of continuity to remain intact. This machinery took the form of the mayors of the palace, figures who, at first glance, appeared to be mere administrators. Yet in truth, they represented one of the most sophisticated transfers of power in European history. Originally, the mayor of the palace was exactly what the title suggests, the manager of the royal household. He oversaw estates, coordinated servants, handled logistics, and ensured the smooth functioning of court life. In a stable kingdom, such a role would never threaten royal authority. But the Merovingian system was not built on administration. It was built on sacred kingship. The king ruled by being, not by managing. And this created a vacuum, one that pragmatic men were quick to fill. As Frankish territories expanded, governance grew more complex. Taxes had to be collected, armies supplied, alliances negotiated. The sacred king, removed from daily administration by tradition and ritual, increasingly relied on intermediaries. Over time, these intermediaries learned how the system worked better than the king himself. They controlled access. They managed information. They spoke in the king's name. And slowly, they stopped needing him. The genius of the mayor's rise lies in its subtlety. There was no open rebellion against the Merovingians. No ideological rejection of sacred bloodlines. On the contrary, the kings were treated with formal respect. They remained symbols of legitimacy, living seals that validated decisions made elsewhere. This arrangement allowed the transition to occur without destabilizing the realm or provoking popular unrest. But beneath this surface harmony lay a profound shift in worldview. The mayors of the palace represented a new model of power, one based on competence, control, and proximity to force rather than ancestry or symbolism. They were often military leaders, landowners, and political operators. Their authority came from effectiveness, not myth. This made them attractive allies to the church, which was itself moving toward institutional power rather than charismatic authority. The alliance between the mayors and the church was not immediate, but it was inevitable. Both sought predictability. Both sought systems that could be replicated, standardized, and controlled. The Merovingian model, with its sacred bodies, inherited legitimacy, and symbolic authority, was incompatible with this future. One of the most telling signs of this shift is how Merovingian kings are described in later sources. They are portrayed as idle, withdrawn, and ceremonial. They sit on thrones, attend rituals, and sign documents placed before them. These portrayals are often cited as evidence of Merovingian weakness. But this interpretation misses the point. The kings did not become weak overnight. The system changed around them. In earlier centuries, sacred kingship did not require active governance. The king's presence ensured cosmic order. His rituals maintained harmony between the natural and divine worlds. Others handled practical matters. When that worldview lost legitimacy, the king's role appeared hollow, not because he had changed, but because belief had. The mayors of the palace understood this shift perfectly. They did not attack the king's bloodline. They simply rendered it obsolete. This process accelerated after Dagobert II. With the most potent embodiment of Merovingian sacred authority removed, the remaining kings posed little threat. Children ascended the throne. Figureheads multiplied. Each reign further normalized the idea that kingship was symbolic rather than substantive. At the same time, the mayors became hereditary. Power began passing from father to son, not through sacred lineage, but through accumulated control of land, armies, and offices. This is a critical moment. The sacred bloodline was being replaced by a political one. Among these families, none would become more important than the lineage that would later be called Carolingian. Charles Martel, the most famous mayor of the palace, never claimed the title of king. This restraint is often praised as humility. In reality, it was strategic brilliance. By ruling without the crown, he avoided provoking resistance while exercising absolute authority. Charles Martel's victory at the Battle of Tours further cemented this arrangement. He was celebrated as the defender of Christendom, despite not being king. The church showered him with legitimacy, land, and moral authority. The Merovingian king, meanwhile, fades into the background of the narrative. This inversion is extraordinary. A non-king becomes the hero of Christian Europe, while the king becomes irrelevant. Yet even now, the Merovingian bloodline was not destroyed. It was preserved, contained within monasteries, marginal courts, and obscurity. Why? because outright elimination would have been dangerous. Sacred bloodlines carry weight beyond politics. Killing them openly risks backlash, rebellion, and mythic amplification. Neutralizing them quietly, however, allows their power to dissipate over generations. The mayors of the palace mastered this technique. They did not challenge belief head-on. They started. Children raised away from power forget their inheritance. Names fade, symbols lose meaning, and over time, even the most potent lineage becomes a rumor rather than a threat. But this process requires control over memory. The church played a crucial role here. Monastic scribes rewrote histories, emphasized certain reigns, minimized others, and framed the transition as natural and necessary. The Merovingians were not described as sacred custodians of ancient authority. They were rebranded as ineffective relics of a primitive age. This narrative persists to this day, yet traces of resistance remain in the gaps. The very need to maintain Merovingian kings as symbolic rulers suggests lingering belief in their legitimacy. If bloodline truly did not matter, they could have been eliminated outright. Instead, they were preserved like empty shells, useful, harmless, and gradually forgotten. This strategy reveals something essential. The mayors of the palace did not simply seize power. They replaced an entire metaphysical framework. Kingship ceased to be cosmic. It became administrative. This transformation did not occur in a single generation. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, and with remarkable discipline. And it left behind something unresolved. Because while political authority shifted successfully, symbolic authority does not vanish so easily. Symbols displaced from the center often migrate to the margins. As the Merovingians were pushed aside, their meaning did not disappear. It went underground, into legends, lineages, and places beyond official control. The East, with its tolerance for sacred kingship and ancient bloodlines, would soon present itself as a logical destination. The rise of the mayors of the palace was not merely a change in leadership. It was the signal that the world no longer had room for what the Merovingians represented. And when a world rejects its oldest custodians, those custodians rarely stay to be erased. They leave. And in doing so, they carry their secrets with them. By the time the Carolingians finally stepped out from behind the curtain and claimed the Frankish crown, the world had already been prepared for the illusion that followed. To later generations, the overthrow of the Merovingians would appear clean, lawful, and even necessary. A weak dynasty replaced by a strong one. Sacred myth giving way to effective rule. Yet this tidy narrative collapses the moment one asks a single, unsettling question. Where did the Merovingians go? History records the moment of transition with deceptive calm. In 751, Pepin the Short, son of Charles Martel, formally deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III. With the blessing of the papacy, Pepin was crowned king, marking the official beginning of Carolingian rule. Childeric, meanwhile, was quietly tonsured, his long hair cut, and sent to a monastery. No execution, no exile to foreign lands, no public reckoning, just silence. This detail alone should give pause. In earlier eras, dethroned dynasties were annihilated. Rivals were eliminated to prevent future claims. Bloodlines were erased through violence, not ritual. Yet here, the Merovingian king is symbolically neutralized and removed from public life, while his fate fades into obscurity. This was not an act of mercy. It was an act of containment. By cutting Childeric's hair, the Carolingians did not merely depose a king. They stripped a sacred vessel of its perceived power. The act was deeply symbolic, understood by all who witnessed it. The king's authority was believed to reside in his body, in his lineage, in the visible signs of his sacred status. Once those signs were removed, the man could be ignored. But a dynasty is not a single man. What followed the Carolingian takeover is one of the strangest disappearances in European history. The Merovingians do not end. They dissolve. Princes, cousins, secondary branches. Entire family networks vanish from clear documentation within a single generation. There are no lists of executions, no mass imprisonments, no systematic slaughter. Instead, there is dispersal without explanation. This is the Great Vanishing. Some Merovingians were absorbed into monasteries, their identities erased behind religious vows. Others married into lesser noble families, their lineage diluted and concealed. But these explanations only account for fragments. They do not explain the abrupt disappearance of those closest to the sacred line, those who have posed the greatest threat to Carolingian legitimacy. The Carolingians understood something critical. Killing sacred bloodlines creates legends. Allowing them to vanish creates forgetfulness. And forgetfulness is far more effective. The Church played a decisive role in this process. By endorsing Pepin's coronation, the papacy established a new principle. Kingship could be granted, not inherited. Authority flowed downward from God to church, then outward to rulers. This inverted the Merovingian worldview completely. Sacred blood no longer mattered. Approval did. Yet this ideological shift could not be imposed overnight. Too many people still believed in the old order. Too many local elites, monasteries, and communities remembered Merovingian legitimacy. To avoid rebellion, the transition had to appear seamless. So the Merovingians were not presented as enemies. They were presented as irrelevant. Chroniclers began to describe them as idle relics of a bygone age. The term do-nothing kings enters the historical lexicon. Their reigns are shortened, their achievements minimized, their rituals mocked. Over time, belief erodes. What once inspired reverence becomes an embarrassment. But belief does not evaporate entirely. It migrates. The most dangerous Merovingians were not those visible at court, but those who carried memory, knowledge of lineage, ritual, and meaning. These individuals could not simply be neutralized through mockery. They had to be removed from the cultural center altogether. This is where alternative histories begin to converge. Evidence suggests that select Merovingian figures were deliberately relocated beyond the Carolingian sphere. Not west, where Rome's influence remained strong, but east, toward regions where sacred kingship still held legitimacy. Byzantium, Armenia, the Caucasus, and even further into former Persian territories offered something Western Europe no longer could: tolerance for ancient bloodlines and non-papal authority. The absence of Western records does not imply absence of movement. It implies loss of jurisdiction. Frankish chroniclers could not follow what they could not control. Once Merovingians crossed into Eastern domains, they slipped beyond the reach of Latin historiography. Greek, Syriac, Armenian, and Persian sources were never fully integrated into Western medieval history. What happened there remained invisible by design. This explains a crucial paradox. The Merovingians disappear from Western records precisely at the moment when Eastern Christian and Near Eastern sources become relevant, but remain unexplored. The Carolingians, meanwhile, wasted no time consolidating their narrative. Charlemagne, Pepin's son, would later be crowned emperor, presented as the rightful successor to Rome itself. This symbolic act rewrote history retroactively. If Charlemagne was Rome's heir, then those who came before him must have been placeholders. This retroactive logic buried the Merovingians beneath a new imperial myth. Yet even Charlemagne's empire reveals cracks. His court included scholars from across Europe and the East. His fascination with ancient learning, relics, and lost knowledge suggests awareness of something inherited but unspoken. The Carolingian Renaissance, often celebrated as a rebirth of learning, may also be interpreted as an attempt to reclaim fragments of knowledge that had slipped away with the old bloodline. Because something had been lost, the Carolingians gained power, but they did not inherit the Merovingian mystery. They ruled territory, but not myth. They controlled institutions, but not memory. And memory has a way of resurfacing in unexpected forms. Legends of lost kings, hidden heirs, and sacred bloodlines begin to circulate quietly after the Merovingian disappearance. These stories do not name names directly. They encode ideas. A rightful lineage displaced, a truth hidden to preserve order, a future return when the world is ready. These are not accidental themes. They reflect unresolved tension. The Great Vanishing, then, is not a failure of record-keeping. It is a success of strategy. The Carolingians did not destroy the Merovingians. They made them invisible. But invisibility is not the same as extinction. What disappears from official history often survives elsewhere, in exile and tradition, in guarded knowledge passed hand to hand rather than written page to page. The Merovingians understood the cost of visibility. Their final act was not resistance, but withdrawal. And withdrawal implies destination. The Carolingian overthrow closed one chapter of European history while quietly opening another beyond its borders. A chapter not written in Latin chronicles, but in movements, marriages, monasteries, and memories carried eastward into lands that did not require papal permission to remember the old world. The throne was lost. The blood was not. And so, with no battles to mark it and no documents to explain it, the Merovingians vanished, not into oblivion, but into shadow. When historians imagine the flight of a defeated dynasty, they often picture a simple pattern: exile to monasteries, quiet absorption into local nobility, or retreat into remote Western lands. For the Merovingians, however, such assumptions may be dangerously incomplete. The disappearance of their bloodline after the Carolingian takeover does not align with the usual routes of political exile. There are too many gaps, too many unexplained absences, too many hints pointing not westward or inward, but east. To understand this possibility, one must first abandon the modern idea of borders. In the early medieval world, Europe was not a closed continent. It was a crossroads. Roman roads still threaded the land like fading veins, connecting Gaul to Italy, the Balkans, Asia Minor, and beyond. Trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and diplomatic corridors formed an invisible network that linked the Frankish world to Byzantium, the Caucasus, and even Persia. These roads did not vanish with Rome. They simply slipped from imperial control into quieter use. The Merovingians were uniquely positioned to know these routes. Unlike later dynasties, they ruled during a period when East and West were still intimately connected. Frankish nobles traveled to Constantinople. Byzantine envoys visited Gaul. Relics, manuscripts, and ideas moved freely along these corridors. Marriage alliances crossed cultural boundaries. Monks journeyed thousands of miles in search of sacred learning. This was not an isolated world. It was a shared one. If the Merovingians needed to disappear, they would not choose ignorance. They would choose familiarity. The traditional assumption is that displaced Merovingians were sent south into Rome's religious orbit, where monasteries could neutralize them. Some certainly were. But this explanation cannot account for the sheer scale of silence that follows. Rome kept records. Papal archives were meticulous when it came to noble bloodlines. If the Merovingians had simply been absorbed into Western monastic life en masse, traces would remain. They do not. This absence suggests a different direction, one beyond the reach of Latin chroniclers. The East offered something the West increasingly lacked: continuity. While Western Europe was reshaping itself around papal authority and feudal hierarchy, the Eastern world preserved older models of kingship and knowledge. Byzantium still saw itself as Rome. Armenia and Georgia maintained sacred royal bloodlines tied to divine ancestry. Persia, even after the fall of the Sasanian Empire, retained deep respect for lineage, cosmology, and ancient wisdom. For a dynasty rooted in sacred blood and symbolic authority, these lands were not foreign. They were familiar. Evidence for Eastern movement appears subtly, not in grand declarations, but in anomalies. Frankish names appear unexpectedly in Eastern records. Western nobles surface in Byzantine courts without clear origin stories. Monastic communities in the East reference kings from the lands of the Franks who arrive as pilgrims and never return. These are not coincidences. They are traces. One of the most compelling indicators lies in the movement of monastic traditions. Irish and Frankish monks are known to have traveled eastward during this period, seeking older forms of Christianity untainted by Roman politics. Some reached Egypt, others traveled through Asia Minor. These journeys were dangerous, expensive, and pointless unless something of immense value awaited at the end. What if they were not traveling for doctrine alone, but as escorts? Royal bloodlines rarely move alone. They move with protection, guidance, and purpose. Monasteries provided the perfect cover, spiritual exile that mass political relocation. A Merovingian prince traveling as a monk would attract little attention while carrying everything that mattered within him. The East also offered anonymity. In Byzantium, the arrival of foreign nobles was routine. Armenian courts regularly absorbed displaced royalty from across the region. Persian traditions valued exiled kings as potential allies. A Frankish prince, stripped of his Western title but carrying ancient lineage, would not appear extraordinary. More importantly, the East did not require public renunciation of sacred kingship. The Merovingians did not need to abandon their worldview to survive there. They could adapt without erasing themselves. There is also the question of timing. The Great Vanishing occurs precisely when eastward movement was easiest. The Silk Road still functioned. Diplomatic relations between Christian and non-Christian states were fluid. The rise of Islam, still centuries away from fully closing these corridors, had not yet hardened borders. This window would not remain open forever. It would be used. Another overlooked factor is fear. The Carolingians and the Church had every reason to encourage eastward dispersal rather than Western concentration. A Merovingian presence within Europe, even diluted, risked future claims. But Merovingians beyond the Christian West posed no immediate threat. They became someone else's problem, or no problem at all. Silence becomes easier when responsibility ends at the border. The routes themselves tell a story. From Austrasia and Neustria, roads led southeast through Lombardy into the Balkans. From there, Constantinople beckoned. Other paths followed the Danube, connecting Central Europe to the Black Sea. Southern routes crossed into Italy, then eastward by sea. These were not theoretical paths. They were arteries of movement known to merchants, monks, and nobles alike. The Merovingians had used them before. Frankish nobles had served in Byzantine armies. Diplomatic gifts flowed between courts. Even relics traveled these paths. If bones of saints could cross continents, so could living kings. What would such an exodus look like? Not a single mass migration, but a gradual dispersal. Small groups, isolated journeys, each departure unremarkable on its own, but devastating in aggregate. Within a generation, the bloodline would be scattered across regions no single chronicler could track. And this scattering serves another purpose: protection. Bloodlines survive not through concentration, but through diffusion. Spread thin enough, they avoid extinction. Hidden well enough, they avoid persecution. The Merovingians, long practiced in symbolic thinking, would understand this instinctively. This also explains why later European legends struggle to locate them. They are everywhere and nowhere. A lost king in one tale, a noble stranger in another, a holy lineage hinted at but never named. The East becomes a symbolic space as much as a geographic one, a direction of preservation rather than domination. It is telling that Western medieval imagination consistently associates lost wisdom with the East. Paradise lies eastward. The Magi come from the East. Ancient knowledge originates beyond Europe. These are not random motifs. They reflect cultural memory. The Merovingians may have become part of that memory. By choosing eastern routes, they stepped outside the story Europe would later tell about itself. They removed their bloodline from the narrative that would produce Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually modern nation-states. In doing so, they ensured survival at the cost of visibility. This choice carries profound implications. If the Merovingians went east, then their influence did not end. It transformed. It merged with other traditions. It seeded ideas, symbols, and lineages that would later resurface in unexpected ways. During the Crusades, in knightly orders, in esoteric traditions obsessed with lost kings and sacred blood. The roads that led east were not roads of escape. They were roads of continuity. They carried more than people. They carried memory. And once memory leaves the center, it does not vanish. It waits. If there was any place in the early medieval world where a displaced sacred bloodline could disappear without truly vanishing, it was Byzantium. To the modern imagination, the Byzantine Empire often appears as a rigid, ceremonial remnant of Rome, decadent, complex, and obsessed with theology. But to those who lived within its borders, Byzantium was something far more flexible and far more ancient. It was an empire built not only on law and armies, but on memory, diplomacy, and the careful management of shadows. Unlike the emerging powers of Western Europe, Byzantium never fully abandoned the ancient idea that authority could be inherited, symbolic, and sacred all at once. Emperors were crowned, but they were also anointed. They ruled, but they also embodied divine order. Court rituals were not mere pageantry. They were expressions of cosmic hierarchy. This made Byzantium uniquely compatible with the Merovingian worldview. For a Frankish sacred bloodline stripped of legitimacy in the West, Constantinople would not have felt alien. It would have felt familiar. The Byzantine court was accustomed to hosting foreign royalty. Exiled kings, deposed princes, and displaced dynasties arrived regularly from every corner of the known world. Persia, Armenia, the Balkans, even distant steppe kingdoms. Some were treated as honored guests. Others were quietly absorbed into the imperial system. A few disappeared into monasteries, diplomacy, or marriage alliances, their original identities softened over time. This was not chaos. It was policy. Byzantium understood that bloodlines were dangerous only when they were visible and concentrated. Dispersed, they became assets. A foreign prince could serve as a diplomat, a general, or a symbolic bridge between cultures. His lineage mattered, but only within carefully controlled contexts. For the Merovingians, this environment offered something invaluable: protection without exposure. Western Europe, under Carolingian and papal influence, demanded clarity. Lineage had to be acknowledged or denied. Authority had to be sanctioned publicly. Byzantium thrived on ambiguity. It allowed identities to overlap, evolve, and dissolve quietly. A Merovingian prince could become a Byzantine noble without fanfare, his past unspoken but not erased. There are hints, never explicit but persistent, that Frankish nobility entered Byzantine service during precisely the period when Merovingian records fall silent. Western names appear in Greek texts, often altered, Hellenized, or partially obscured. Their origins are rarely explained. They simply arrive, already educated, already noble, already connected. These men did not come from nowhere. Beyond the court, Byzantium offered another refuge: monasteries. Eastern monasticism differed sharply from its Western counterpart. While Western monasteries increasingly fell under papal oversight and political patronage, Eastern monasteries retained older traditions rooted in mysticism, silence, and ascetic withdrawal. Identity mattered less than lineage of teaching. Names were often abandoned altogether. For someone seeking to preserve memory while abandoning visibility, this was ideal. A Merovingian entering an Eastern monastery would not be interrogated about ancestry. He would not be recorded as a political threat. He would become a vessel of tradition rather than a claimant to power. His bloodline could continue through protected unions or symbolic transmission, while his public identity dissolved into prayer and obscurity. But Byzantium was more than a place to hide. It was a place to connect. From Constantinople, roads extended outward in every direction, to Armenia and Georgia, where ancient Christian kingship remained central, to Syria and Egypt, where older theological traditions survived beyond Roman Orthodoxy, to Persia, where lineage and cosmology still shaped political legitimacy. Byzantium was not an endpoint. It was a hub. This matters because the Merovingian story does not end with survival. It points toward preservation of something specific: knowledge, legitimacy, or symbolic authority that could not be allowed to die. Byzantium was uniquely equipped for this task. Its scholars preserved Greek philosophy while the West forgot it. Its theologians debated mysteries the West declared closed. Its archivists guarded texts that would not resurface in Europe for centuries. It was, in many ways, a civilization built on keeping dangerous ideas alive without letting them destabilize the present. That is why it endured. The empire also possessed a sophisticated culture of secrecy. Court politics relied on layers of implication rather than declaration. Titles could be honorary or empty. Relationships could be real or ceremonial. Power was often exercised through silence rather than command. This made Byzantium incomprehensible to many Western observers, and perfect for those who wished to disappear without being erased. If the Merovingians carried relics, genealogies, or teachings deemed unacceptable in the West, Byzantium could absorb them without conflict. What threatened Rome might merely intrigue Constantinople. There is also a symbolic dimension that cannot be ignored. Byzantium considered itself the true Rome. Western Europe, from this perspective, was a fallen periphery. If the Merovingians believed their bloodline predated Western institutions, aligning with Byzantium would have felt like a return to continuity rather than exile. This reframes the idea of flight entirely. The Merovingians were not running from history. They were repositioning themselves within it. And Byzantium understood the value of such repositioning. An empire that survived by adaptation recognized fellow custodians of memory. It did not ask them to abandon who they were. It taught them how to endure. This may explain why Western history struggles to trace Merovingian influence after their disappearance. It is not that they ceased to exist. It is that they entered a civilization whose records were never fully integrated into Western historical consciousness. Greek, Syriac, and Armenian sources remained marginal, untranslated, or ignored for centuries. What the West does not read, it assumes does not exist. Yet traces remain in echoes. Byzantine fascination with Western relics. Frankish symbolism appearing in Eastern art. Later medieval Europeans encountering Eastern traditions that feel uncannily familiar, as though something long lost had survived elsewhere. These moments hint at continuity beneath separation. Byzantium eventually fell, but its memory scattered across the East and West. Scholars fled to Italy. Manuscripts crossed seas. Ideas re-entered Europe transformed. If the Merovingians embedded themselves within this flow, their influence could have returned centuries later in altered form, unrecognizable, but not absent. This possibility forces a reconsideration of disappearance itself. Perhaps the Merovingians did not vanish because they were weak. Perhaps they vanished because they were careful. They chose an empire that understood how to keep secrets alive by refusing to expose them. In Byzantium, silence was not erasure. It was protection, and in that protection, the Merovingian story did not end. It changed language, changed landscape, and waited, hidden among emperors, monks, and shadows, for a future that could not yet name it. Beyond the grandeur of Byzantium, beyond the imperial courts and theological debates of Constantinople, there existed a region uniquely suited for the preservation of endangered bloodlines and forbidden memory. A land of mountains so high they fractured empires, of valleys so isolated they preserved ancient tongues long after the world had moved on. This was the Caucasus, a threshold between worlds, where Europe dissolved into Asia and history learned how to hide. For a lineage like the Merovingians, the Caucasus was not a place of exile. It was a sanctuary. The kingdoms of Armenia and Georgia occupied a singular position in early medieval history. They were among the first states to adopt Christianity, yet they did so independently of Rome. Their faith retained deep connections to older traditions, Semitic, Persian, and Hellenistic, blending doctrine with mysticism, lineage, and sacred kingship. Here, a king was not merely a ruler by consent of clergy. He was a divinely anchored presence, chosen through blood and sustained through ritual. This worldview would have resonated deeply with Merovingian identity. Unlike Western Europe, where sacred kingship was being dismantled and replaced by papal authorization, the Caucasus preserved the belief that royal blood carried metaphysical weight. Armenian kings traced their lineage back to biblical patriarchs. Georgian rulers were bound to divine ancestry and cosmic order. Blood was not an inconvenience. It was the foundation of legitimacy. For a displaced Frankish sacred line, this environment did not require disguise. It required adaptation. Geography reinforced this protection. The Caucasus Mountains formed natural vaults, corridors accessible only to those who knew the passes, valleys isolated for generations, monasteries carved into cliffs, fortresses perched beyond the reach of armies. Empires passed around these lands more often than through them. Control was temporary. Memory was permanent. This is why the Caucasus became a refuge for so many things history sought to erase. Heresies condemned in Constantinople survived here. Ancient languages vanished elsewhere, but remained spoken in mountain villages. Royal families displaced by larger powers were absorbed, intermarried, and quietly preserved. Names changed. Lineages continued. Western historians rarely looked here, and when they did, they misunderstood what they saw. Armenian and Georgian chronicles speak of foreign nobles arriving from the west, often unnamed, sometimes described only as from the lands of the Franks or from beyond the great rivers. These figures appear abruptly, already bearing status, already integrated into court or monastic life. Their origins are not explained, because explanation was unnecessary. In these societies, a noble did not need Rome's approval to exist. One of the most striking features of Caucasian Christianity was its relationship with secrecy. Sacred knowledge was not broadcast. It was guarded. Monasteries functioned as vaults, not only of manuscripts, but of genealogy, ritual practice, and encoded memory. Some texts were copied rarely, only when necessary. Others were never written at all, transmitted orally through trusted lines. This mirrors Merovingian tradition precisely. If the Merovingians carried something that could not survive exposure, whether bloodline claims, relics, or interpretations of Christian origins, the Caucasus offered a structure designed for concealment without loss. Knowledge could be buried in altitude, protected by terrain rather than walls. Even architecture supports this idea. Cave monasteries like those in Vardzia or Geghard were not merely places of worship. They were defensive sanctuaries, designed to disappear into stone. They preserved both people and memory during invasions. A lineage hidden here could survive centuries without attracting attention. There's also the cultural alignment to consider. Armenian and Georgian royal ideology emphasized continuity through catastrophe. These were lands repeatedly conquered, divided, and contested, yet their dynasties endured. Survival itself became sacred. Kings were expected to retreat, regroup, and return. The idea that a royal line might withdraw temporarily to preserve itself was not weakness. It was wisdom. This stands in sharp contrast to Western narratives, which equated disappearance with defeat. For the Merovingians, whose power was symbolic rather than territorial, such thinking would have felt natural. Thrones could be lost. Blood could not. Some alternative traditions suggest that Merovingian descendants married into Caucasian nobility. Their lineage folded quietly into local dynasties. Over generations, identity would shift. Frankish origins would become irrelevant. What mattered was continuity, not name. Others proposed that the Merovingians acted as custodians rather than rulers, guarding texts, relics, or traditions within monastic networks rather than courts. In this view, kingship itself was secondary. Preservation was the true goal. This would explain why Western legends later speak of hidden kings or sleeping bloodlines rather than exile monarchs. The idea is not of rule postponed, but of presence concealed. The Caucasus also sits astride ancient trade routes connecting Europe to Persia, Central Asia, and the Near East. Ideas moved here even when armies could not. This made the region a crossroads of theology and cosmology. Jewish mysticism, early Christianity, Zoroastrian symbolism, and Greek philosophy intersected here in ways impossible in the increasingly rigid West. If the Merovingians carried hybrid traditions, Christian yet pre-Christian, royal yet priestly, the Caucasus could accommodate them without contradiction. What makes this region especially important is how little of its history was incorporated into Western medieval scholarship. Latin Europe did not read Armenian chronicles. Georgian texts were not translated. Even Byzantine sources treated the region as peripheral. This created a historical blind spot, a place where things could happen without being recorded in the West. Silence, once again, becomes meaningful. When the Merovingians disappear from Frankish records, they do not reappear elsewhere under the same name. But names are tools of visibility. Survival often requires shedding them. The absence of the name does not mean absence of the line. It means transformation. Centuries later, when crusaders passed through the Caucasus, they encountered Christian kingdoms that felt ancient, unfamiliar, and strangely aligned with lost European traditions. Some Western knights wrote of encountering noble families who claimed descent from kings older than Rome, guardians of sacred knowledge no longer known in the West. These accounts were never fully integrated into European history. They were curiosities, not conclusions. Yet they linger. The idea of mountain vaults, both literal and symbolic, haunts this region. Vaults protect what must not be lost. They imply value, not abandonment. The Merovingians, stripped of throne and name, may have become precisely that, something locked away until a future no longer hostile to its existence. The Caucasus does not offer dramatic endings. It offers endurance. And endurance is often invisible to those who only look for conquest. If the Merovingians sought a place where memory could survive without demanding recognition, where blood could persist without provoking annihilation, where sacred kingship was understood even when unspoken, they could not have chosen better. In these mountains, history learned how to whisper instead of proclaim. And whispers, when protected long enough, can outlast empires. Beyond the Caucasus, beyond even the easternmost reaches of Byzantine influence, lay a civilizational memory far older than Europe's kingdoms and churches. Persia, known by many names across centuries, was not merely a land, but an idea of kingship rooted in cosmic order, of lineage tied to light and fire, of authority understood as sacred balance rather than political convenience. For the Merovingians, whose worldview no longer fit within the tightening boundaries of Western Christianity, Persia represented something both distant and uncannily familiar. To Western chroniclers, Persia often appears as an adversary, a fading empire, or a cultural other. But this portrayal obscures Persia's true role in early medieval history. Even after the fall of the Sasanian Empire in the 7th century, Persian structures of thought did not vanish. They adapted. They endured beneath new rulers, new religions, and new names. Zoroastrian cosmology, royal ideology, and sacred symbolism continued to shape the region long after political power changed hands. This continuity matters. Persian kingship was never merely administrative. The Shah was the guardian of Asha, cosmic truth and order. His legitimacy flowed from alignment with the divine structure of the universe. Fire temples burned continuously, not as objects of worship, but as symbols of eternal order and purity. Light was not metaphorical, it was metaphysical. This model bears striking resemblance to the Merovingian conception of kingship. Like the Persian Shahs, Merovingian kings were believed to embody order rather than impose it. Their authority was inherent, not granted. Ritual mattered more than decree. Lineage mattered more than law. These parallels are not superficial. They point to shared ancestry of ideas, perhaps inherited through Indo-European traditions, perhaps through far older channels of cultural transmission. Some alternative historians have noted that Merovingian origin myths contain echoes of Eastern cosmology. The strange legend of descent from a semi-divine sea being, long dismissed as fantasy, may symbolize hybrid lineage, royal blood mingled with something older, more elemental. In Persian tradition, kings often trace their origins to divine or semi-divine ancestors, beings that existed before human history became linear. These myths were not meant to be believed literally. They were meant to assert legitimacy beyond time. If Merovingian custodians carried such concepts eastward, Persia would not reject them as heresy. It would recognize them as familiar. Even under Islamic rule, Persian identity retained deep respect for lineage, scholarship, and ancient memory. Islam did not erase Persian culture. It absorbed it. Fire temples became symbolic. Cosmology shifted language, but not structure. Royal bloodlines continued to matter, even when stripped of thrones. For displaced Western nobles, Persia offered anonymity without erasure. A Merovingian descendant entering Persian-influenced territory would not be required to renounce his understanding of sacred authority. He would not be forced to redefine kingship as a papal favor. Instead, he could exist within a framework that understood the difference between political rule and metaphysical legitimacy. There are subtle clues that Western elites reached Persian lands during this period. Trade routes connected the Caucasus to northern Iran. Armenian intermediaries bridged Christian and Persian worlds. Scholars traveled eastward in search of lost sciences, astronomy, medicine, cosmology, that Europe had forgotten. What appears as intellectual curiosity may also have been pilgrimage. Fire temples themselves deserve closer attention. Though often portrayed as purely religious sites, they functioned as centers of knowledge, lineage memory, and ritual continuity. Priestly families guarded teachings across generations. Initiation was selective. Knowledge was layered. Outsiders saw flame. Initiates saw order. This structure mirrors how sacred bloodlines operate. If Merovingian custodians sought a place where memory could be preserved without writing everything down, fire temples and Persian priestly networks offered exactly that. Knowledge did not need to be recorded in texts vulnerable to destruction. It lived in ritual, repetition, and lineage. The idea that Merovingian tradition merged with Persian cosmology may seem radical. It explains several later mysteries. Medieval European fascination with Eastern wisdom, alchemy, and light symbolism did not arise in a vacuum. It arrived through channels reopened during the Crusades, channels that may have been seeded centuries earlier. Fire becomes light. Light becomes gnosis. Gnosis becomes forbidden knowledge. Persia was a keeper of such transformations. It is also important to consider that Persian political culture valued exiled royalty. Displaced kings were not automatically enemies. They were potential allies, symbols, or future claimants. A foreign bloodline carried prestige, not danger. In such a system, a Merovingian descendant could find patronage rather than persecution. This reframes the idea of exile yet again. The Merovingians may not have seen Persia as a last refuge, but as a continuation of an older world order, one in which sacred kingship was not an embarrassment, but a responsibility. Even the timing aligns. The Merovingian disappearance coincides with seismic shifts across Eurasia, the fall of old empires, the rise of new religions, and the opening of cultural corridors that would soon close. Those who moved during this window could embed themselves deeply before borders hardened. Once embedded, they would become invisible to Western eyes. Persian historiography did not concern itself with Frankish dynasties. Names would change. Lineages would blend. Memory would persist without reference to origin. From the perspective of the West, the Merovingians would be gone. From the perspective of continuity, they would simply be elsewhere. Later European myths of hidden knowledge, eternal flames, and Eastern guardians may preserve distorted memories of this survival. Stories of sages who guard ancient truths in the East, waiting for a time when the West can receive them again, echo this pattern precisely. The Merovingians, once guardians of a sacred order in Europe, may have recognized that their role was no longer geographic. It was custodial. Persia did not require them to rule. It allowed them to remember. And remembering, in an age of suppression, is the most radical act of all. If the Caucasus offered stone vaults, Persia offered fire, living continuity, invisible yet enduring. A flame does not need a throne to burn. It only needs protection. In the fire temples and cosmological traditions of the East, the Merovingian story may have found not an ending, but a transformation so complete that history could no longer follow it. And that, perhaps, was the point. By the time the word Grail begins to surface in medieval Europe, centuries after the Merovingians have vanished from the Frankish throne, it already arrives wrapped in confusion. A cup, a stone, a dish, a relic carried from the Last Supper, or caught beneath the cross. Yet the more closely one examines the earliest Grail traditions, the more unstable the object becomes. Its form shifts, its meaning refuses to settle, and slowly, an uncomfortable realization emerges. The Grail was never meant to be an object at all. It was a vessel, but not in the way later storytellers imagined. In its earliest appearances, particularly in texts influenced by Celtic and Eastern Christian traditions, the Grail is not described as something to be possessed. It cannot be owned, conquered, or even clearly seen by those unprepared to understand it. Instead, it reveals itself selectively. It nourishes some and blinds others. It heals but also judges. These are not the behaviors of an artifact. They are the behaviors of knowledge. Sacred knowledge. This interpretation transforms everything, especially when placed alongside the Merovingian mystery. If the Merovingians were custodians rather than mere rulers, then the thing they guarded would not have been a physical relic easily seized by enemies. It would have been something far more elusive and far more dangerous. An understanding of legitimacy, divinity, and continuity that contradicted the emerging authority of Rome. In this framework, the Grail becomes a code word, a symbolic container for ideas that could not be spoken openly without provoking suppression. Early Christian history supports this possibility. The first centuries of Christianity were not unified. They were fragmented, diverse, and often contradictory. Gnostic groups, Jewish Christian sects, and Eastern communities preserved teachings that emphasized inner knowledge, direct divine connection, and lineage-based authority. These ideas conflicted directly with the institutional church's move toward centralized control. By the time orthodoxy solidified, alternative interpretations were branded heretical and destroyed wherever possible. Wherever possible, but not everywhere. The Merovingians emerged during this chaotic period of doctrinal fluidity. Their Christianity was early, ambiguous, and deeply symbolic. It did not align neatly with Roman theology. Their kingship model, rooted in sacred blood rather than ecclesiastical approval, reflects a worldview in which divine authority flows through lineage and knowledge, not institution. This is the world from which the Grail concept arises. In some traditions, the Grail is associated not with a cup, but with a lineage. The phrase sangreal, royal blood, later emerges in esoteric interpretations, suggesting continuity of sacred descent rather than possession of an object. While modern scholars debate the linguistic accuracy of this phrase, its symbolic resonance cannot be ignored. Medieval writers understood the Grail as something transmitted, not found. Transmission implies inheritance. Inheritance implies blood. But blood alone is not enough. The Grail does not simply pass to heirs. It reveals itself only to those capable of understanding it. This suggests initiation, a process of learning, purification, and alignment. Knowledge preserved across generations, guarded by families, orders, or monastic networks, fits this model precisely. If the Merovingians carried such a tradition, it would explain both their early prominence and their later disappearance. Knowledge that challenges institutional authority cannot survive in open daylight. It must be hidden, encoded, mythologized. Over time, stories replace explanations. Symbols replace doctrine. A Grail replaces a worldview. As the Merovingians moved eastward into Byzantium, the Caucasus, Persia, this knowledge would not have been abandoned. It would have been reframed within cultures that already understood symbolic transmission. Eastern Christianity preserved mysticism. Persian traditions preserved cosmology. Armenian and Georgian churches preserved lineage-based sanctity. In these contexts, Grail knowledge could survive without naming itself. When fragments of this knowledge later returned to Europe, they did so stripped of context. This may explain why Grail stories erupt suddenly in the 12th century during the Crusades. European knights encounter Eastern traditions they cannot fully comprehend. They return with symbols, stories, and half-understood concepts. The Grail becomes romanticized, objectified, and externalized. What was once internal knowledge becomes a quest for a thing. But even in these distorted forms, traces remain. The Grail cannot be seized by force. Knights who attempt to claim it through violence fail. Only those who demonstrate humility, understanding, and purity are permitted to approach it. This is not the logic of relic hunting. It is the logic of initiation. Furthermore, the Grail is often associated with a wounded king, a ruler whose injury reflects a broken land. Healing the king heals the kingdom. This motif mirrors sacred kingship traditions exactly. The health of the land depends on the integrity of the king. When the sacred order is broken, decay follows. The Merovingians, removed from power, may have been perceived as such wounded kings, displaced custodians whose absence created imbalance. The Grail stories could be Europe's subconscious attempt to process that loss. There is also the matter of secrecy. Grail knowledge is never written plainly. It appears in allegory, poetry, and coded narrative. This is consistent with traditions that have learned the cost of openness. Knowledge that survives persecution learns to hide inside story. The church tolerated Grail romances because they appeared harmless, fictional, entertaining. Yet embedded within them were ideas dangerously close to forbidden theology, sacred bloodlines, divine kingship, direct access to holiness without clerical mediation. Ideas once carried by the Merovingians. If the Grail was knowledge, then the Merovingians were not guarding an object that could be stolen. They were guarding a way of understanding the world, a worldview in which divine authority flowed through continuity rather than hierarchy, in which history was cyclical, not linear, in which kingship was a responsibility to preserve balance, not a license to rule. Such ideas would have been intolerable to an institution building power through uniformity. By transforming the Grail into an object, later Europe neutralized its threat. Objects can be lost. Knowledge cannot, unless it is forgotten. Yet forgetting was never complete. Fragments survived in knightly orders, mystical texts, and whispered legends. The Templars, so often associated with Grail lore, were deeply engaged with Eastern traditions. They guarded knowledge, not just treasure. Their suppression mirrors earlier patterns seen with the Merovingians: sudden destruction, confiscated records, unresolved silence. The pattern repeats because the threat repeats. Knowledge that challenges centralized authority always attracts suppression. The Merovingians may have understood this better than anyone. Their choice to withdraw rather than confront preserved the Grail tradition in a form that could survive centuries of hostility. By allowing the knowledge to become myth, they ensured it would endure beyond any single dynasty. The Grail, then, is not something waiting to be found in a hidden cave or forgotten church. It is something waiting to be recognized. It lives in patterns, in symbols, in the persistence of questions that refuse to die. It lives in the unease that arises whenever bloodline, legitimacy, and sacred authority intersect outside institutional control. And it lives in the long shadow cast by a dynasty that vanished without being destroyed. If the Merovingians carried the Grail eastward, they did not carry a cup. They carried a memory of how the world once understood power, divinity, and continuity. They carried a knowledge too dangerous to rule with, and too valuable to let die. The Grail was never lost. It was hidden in plain sight, disguised as story, protected by misunderstanding, waiting for a listener capable of hearing what the myth has been saying all along. Maps are often treated as neutral tools, objective representations of geography, drawn to help travelers move from one place to another. But in the ancient and medieval worlds, maps served a very different purpose. They were not designed to guide the masses. They were designed to preserve memory for those who already knew how to see. And in the story of the Merovingians, maps may be among the most misunderstood and most revealing artifacts of all. To begin with, medieval maps are strange. Distances are distorted. Directions are unreliable. Sacred sites loom larger than cities. Seas bend unnaturally. Entire regions appear compressed, rotated, or pushed to the margins. For centuries, historians dismissed these inaccuracies as ignorance. But this assumption collapses when one realizes that medieval people were not ignorant of geography. Roman maps, itineraries, and travel accounts had existed for centuries. Merchants crossed continents. Pilgrims reached Jerusalem from Gaul and returned alive. Knowledge of space existed. So why draw maps that appear wrong? Because they were not meant to be read literally. Many medieval maps functioned as mnemonic devices, memory maps, designed to encode journeys, hierarchies, and sacred relationships rather than physical accuracy. To someone outside the tradition, they look chaotic. To someone initiated, they speak clearly. They show what matters, not what lies where. This distinction is crucial when considering Merovingian disappearance. If a dynasty sought to move people, knowledge, or bloodlines without leaving obvious trails, they would not rely on written itineraries or explicit instructions. They would rely on symbolic geography, routes encoded in ritual, story, and image. Maps could guide those who knew how to interpret them, while misleading everyone else. Consider how the East is depicted. In many medieval maps, the East is not simply a direction. It is a realm of origin, wisdom, and sacred beginnings. Paradise lies in the East. The sun rises in the East. Ancient kings come from the East. This is not theology alone, it is cultural memory. The East represents continuity with a world older than Europe's institutions. If the Merovingians carried their legacy eastward, they were following a symbolic current already embedded in the medieval imagination. Certain maps show elongated corridors stretching eastward, dotted with monasteries, holy sites, and indistinct cities whose names blur between myth and reality. These are not navigation errors. They are signals. They indicate movement that is meant to be followed by those who understand the code. The absence of clear political borders on these maps is equally revealing. Instead of kingdoms, we see zones of influence, spiritual centers, and transitional spaces. This aligns perfectly with a bloodline that no longer ruled territory, but still moved through sacred networks. For such a lineage, borders were irrelevant. Access mattered more than ownership. There are also places that appear repeatedly without explanation. Mountain ranges exaggerated in size, rivers drawn as barriers rather than waterways, cities placed far from their known locations. Mountains, especially, are emphasized far beyond their physical scale. This echoes the Caucasus theme once again. Mountains are vaults. They hide what cannot be displayed. By enlarging them symbolically, maps draw attention to concealment. Rivers, too, are depicted as thresholds. Crossing a river often marks transformation rather than distance. In many traditions, rivers separate worlds, the living from the dead, the known from the hidden. To cross certain rivers on a map is not simply to travel. It is to change status. This symbolism aligns disturbingly well with the idea of Merovingian relocation. They did not merely move geographically. They crossed into a different mode of existence, one in which their identity was no longer public, their authority no longer visible, and their memory preserved through symbol rather than chronicle. Maps also erase selectively. Entire regions vanish from some medieval maps, while insignificant villages appear prominently. This is not oversight. It is emphasis. What is erased is not forgotten. It is protected. By omitting precise detail, cartographers ensured that only those with prior knowledge could reconstruct the journey. This practice appears again and again in traditions concerned with secrecy, alchemy, mysticism, and initiation. Instructions are never complete. They assume the reader already knows the first steps. If the Merovingians left behind maps or influenced those who did, they would never have created something obvious. They would have created something deniable. Another unsettling detail lies in the orientation of many medieval maps. North is not always at the top. East often is. This is not arbitrary. East-oriented maps prioritize origin over destination. They suggest that to understand where something went, one must understand where it came from. For the Merovingians, origin mattered deeply. Their authority did not come from conquest, but from descent. Their maps would reflect that worldview. They would not chart expansion. They would chart continuity. Later European explorers, operating within a different mindset, struggled to interpret these maps. They searched for routes and found confusion. They searched for distances and found distortion. In doing so, they missed the point entirely. The maps were not broken. They were encrypted. This encryption may explain why so many supposed routes to lost knowledge lead nowhere when followed literally. Grail seekers, treasure hunters, and modern researchers repeatedly chase geographic ghosts, convinced something physical has been hidden in a specific location. They fail because they are reading the maps as objects, not as language. The Merovingian legacy, if preserved through such means, would never be pinned to a single place. It would be mobile, adaptive, and self-erasing. Anyone could look at the map. Only a few would understand it. There is also a political dimension. Explicit maps create claims. Implicit maps avoid them. By encoding movement symbolically, the Merovingians ensured that no future power could accuse them of plotting, conspiring, or retaining territorial ambition. They were nowhere officially, everywhere quietly. This strategy mirrors everything else we have seen: symbolic kingship, hidden bloodlines, knowledge preserved through story. Maps that were never meant to be read are a natural extension of that worldview. What survives today are fragments, maps copied, altered, misunderstood, stripped of context. They appear quaint or foolish to modern eyes. But beneath their apparent simplicity lies a refusal to be conquered by clarity. And that refusal is deliberate. The West would later develop precise cartography as a tool of empire. Measurement became control. Borders became law. Everything was named, owned, and taxed. In such a world, symbolic maps no longer made sense. But before that world fully emerged, there was time for disappearance. The Merovingians did not leave behind clear trails because they did not want to be followed. They wanted to be remembered by the right people, without being found by the wrong ones. Maps became stories. Stories became legends. Legends became noise. And noise is the best camouflage of all. If we are looking for Merovingian paths on medieval maps and finding only confusion, perhaps that confusion is the point. The maps are doing exactly what they were designed to do: reveal everything while telling nothing. They were never meant to guide outsiders. They were meant to remind insiders where memory lives and where it must never be named. Silence in history is rarely empty. More often, it is engineered. It is shaped by decisions, fears, loyalties, and unspoken agreements. Nowhere is this more evident than in the monasteries of early medieval Europe, the very institutions entrusted with preserving memory. When the Merovingians vanished from power, it was not armies or kings who sealed their disappearance. It was monks. At first glance, this sounds paradoxical. Monasteries are assumed to be neutral spaces of prayer and scholarship, removed from politics. But in the early Middle Ages, monasteries were not passive observers of history. They were its editors. What they chose to copy survived. What they chose not to copy vanished. And what they altered reshaped the future. Before the Carolingian takeover, Merovingian monasteries were vibrant, independent centers of learning. Many followed traditions that blended Roman Christianity with Celtic mysticism and older symbolic cosmologies. They preserved genealogies, royal rituals, and hybrid theological ideas that had not yet been condemned as heresy. These monasteries were often closely tied to the Merovingian royal family. They did not merely serve the kings, they remembered them. This is precisely what made them dangerous. As Carolingian power consolidated, monasteries were gradually brought under stricter oversight. Rules were standardized. Liturgical practices were unified. Most importantly, historiography was disciplined. Chronicles were no longer simple records of events. They became instruments of legitimacy, and legitimacy required forgetting. One of the most striking patterns after the fall of the Merovingians is not hostile writing, but absence. Chronicles that once recorded royal lineages in meticulous detail suddenly skip generations. Kings are mentioned briefly, without context. Sacred rituals disappear from description. The Merovingians are neither praised nor condemned. They're simply gone. This kind of omission is more powerful than denunciation. Denunciation invites defense. Silence invites erasure. Monks were not ignorant of what they were omitting. Many had lived through the transition. Some had personally known Merovingian patrons. Their silence was not accidental. It was strategic. Why would men devoted to truth participate in such an act? Because monasteries survived through patronage. Under the Carolingians, that patronage came with conditions. Land were granted. Privileges were confirmed. Protection was offered. But in return, loyalty was expected. Not just political loyalty, but narrative loyalty. Monasteries that resisted risked dissolution, confiscation, or replacement. The choice was stark. Remember the old kings and lose everything, or forget them and endure. Most chose endurance. Yet not all forgetting was equal. Some monasteries erased overt references while preserving coded memory. Names vanished, but symbols remained. Rituals were simplified, but not destroyed. Certain feast days, architectural alignments, and liturgical phrases persisted long after their original meaning had been obscured. This suggests compromise rather than total submission. The most revealing evidence lies in how Dagobert II was treated. His assassination should have provoked outrage or theological explanation. Instead, his story dissolves into ambiguity, only to reemerge later in the sanitized form of sainthood. The monastery remembers him, but only as a holy relic of the past, not as a node in a living bloodline. This transformation is not innocent. Saints are removed from dynastic time. They do not produce heirs. They do not threaten rulers. By canonizing Dagobert, the monasteries effectively sealed his line in amber. Memory preserved. Continuity denied. This same pattern repeats elsewhere. Merovingian-associated saints proliferate, while Merovingian genealogies disappear. Blood becomes holiness. Lineage becomes legend. The silence deepens when one compares Western monastic records with Eastern ones. In Byzantium and the Caucasus, monasteries often recorded lineage with reverence. Kingship and sanctity were intertwined. Royal blood was not embarrassing. It was evidence of divine order. Silence was used sparingly, only when survival demanded it. The Western silence, by contrast, is systematic. This suggests coordination, not coincidence. One must also consider what monasteries did not lose. They retained classical texts, theological debates, and local histories, sometimes with remarkable accuracy. They knew how to preserve when they wished to. That they did not preserve Merovingian continuity tells us everything we need to know. The silence was chosen. But chosen silence does not always erase completely. It leaves behind anomalies, references that make no sense without context. A noble lineage mentioned once, then never again. A monastery founded by a forgotten king. A land grant traced to a ruler whose reign is otherwise undocumented. These are fault lines in the narrative. They reveal stress where memory was forced to bend. In some monasteries, marginal notes appear centuries later, added by unknown hands. Brief, cryptic references to lost kings, Eastern journeys, or sacred blood. These notes are never elaborated. They do not challenge the main text openly. They whisper from the margins. Such marginalia are dangerous precisely because they survive scrutiny. They are too small to prosecute, too vague to refute, too quiet to suppress. This is how forbidden memory endures. It is also important to understand that monasteries were not monolithic. Some resisted longer than others. Some preserved local traditions quietly. Others aligned eagerly with Carolingian power. The result was uneven silence, thicker in some regions, thinner in others. Where the silence is thinnest, legends are strongest. Rural Europe, far from royal courts, preserved stories of long-haired kings, sacred blood, and rightful rulers sleeping beneath the land. These stories were not written down, but they were not invented either. They survived precisely because monasteries could not fully control oral tradition. Yet even oral tradition eventually bends. As generations passed, stories lost specificity. Names changed, events blurred, but the emotional core remained. Something sacred had been taken, hidden, or lost, not destroyed but withheld. This emotional residue matters. It suggests that the Merovingian disappearance was felt, even if it was not explained. People sensed a rupture. They did not know how to articulate it. The monasteries did not help them do so, and so the silence became complete. By the time medieval Europe entered its high period, the Merovingians existed only as caricatures or footnotes. Their deeper meaning was inaccessible without reading between the lines, and most were never taught how. This is perhaps the greatest success of the Carolingian transition, not the seizure of power, but the control of memory. Yet the silence of the monasteries also created a paradox. By suppressing Merovingian continuity, they inadvertently transformed it into something mythic, something that could resurface in altered forms, Grail legends, hidden kings, lost lineages. Silence does not destroy meaning. It displaces it, and displacement, as we have seen, is the defining pattern of this entire story. The monasteries did not erase the Merovingians. They moved them out of sight. They pushed them eastward, symbolically and literally. They buried them beneath prayer, parchment, and sanctioned forgetting. But buried things sometimes endure better than exposed ones. In the quiet halls where monks copied scripture by candlelight, choices were made that shaped centuries. What they chose not to write became just as influential as what they did. And in that vast, deliberate silence, the Merovingian legacy was not extinguished. It was sealed, waiting not for rediscovery, but for recognition by those willing to listen closely enough to hear what the silence has been saying all along. When the Crusades erupted at the end of the 11th century, Western Europe presented them as sudden explosions of faith, armies driven by devotion, marching eastward to reclaim Holy Land. Yet beneath the rhetoric of pilgrimage and piety lay older currents, quieter motivations, and echoes of unfinished history. For those willing to look beyond banners and battle cries, the Crusades appear less like a beginning and more like a return. And within that return, the shadow of the Merovingians quietly reemerges. By the time the first Crusaders reached the eastern Mediterranean, nearly 4 centuries had passed since the Merovingians vanished from Western power. Officially, they were irrelevant, forgotten kings replaced by Carolingians, then Capetians. Yet the Crusaders did not arrive in the East as strangers. Again and again, chroniclers remark on their uncanny familiarity with terrain, sacred sites, and local traditions. This familiarity is often attributed to divine guidance or chance. But coincidence fails to explain its consistency, especially when the Knights Templar enter the story. The Templars appear suddenly, fully formed, and strangely well-informed. Unlike other knightly orders, they were not merely warriors. They were archivists, engineers, diplomats, and bankers. They moved easily between cultures. They communicated fluently with Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Most strikingly, they possessed knowledge of sacred geography that far exceeded that of ordinary pilgrims. This knowledge did not originate in Europe. The Templars established their headquarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a location layered with meaning across Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. Officially, they were guarding pilgrims. Unofficially, they were excavating, studying, and listening. They spent years beneath the ruins of Solomon's Temple, a site associated not only with ancient worship, but with kingship, lineage, and divine order. This focus aligns disturbingly well with Merovingian preoccupations. Sacred kingship, bloodline legitimacy, custodianship of divine order rather than territorial rule. These themes, suppressed in Western Europe, had not vanished. They had simply been displaced eastward into traditions the Crusaders were now encountering firsthand. It is here that echoes begin to form. Templar symbols, rituals, and myths contain anomalies that resist simple explanation. Their seal depicts two knights on one horse, a symbol often interpreted as humility, but more accurately reflecting duality. Two bodies, one mission. Two identities, one order. This duality mirrors the idea of hidden lineage beneath visible authority. Their initiation rites were secretive, oral, and symbolic, never fully written down. Accusations during their later trials claim that Templars denied Christ, worshipped strange heads, and practiced forbidden rituals. Modern historians dismiss these as fabrications. Yet fabrications are most effective when they distort something real. The Church did not accuse the Templars of nothing. It accused them of knowing too much. What if the Templars were not inventing new heresies, but encountering old ones? As Crusader states formed, Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, Jerusalem, Western nobles settled in lands that had long preserved alternative Christian traditions. Armenian, Syriac, and Eastern Orthodox communities did not share Rome's theological rigidity. They remembered stories Western Europe had buried. They preserved genealogies Rome had erased. They understood kingship in ways Europe had forgotten. Within these states, marriages occurred. Alliances formed. Bloodlines mingled. A Frankish knight marrying into an Armenian noble family did not merely gain land. He gained memory. Some Crusader families claimed descent from ancient kings whose origins could not be verified in Western records. Others traced lineage to Jerusalem itself. These claims were tolerated in the East, where sacred ancestry carried meaning, but ignored or dismissed in the West. Ignored, but not destroyed. The Templars operated at the center of this exchange. They were uniquely positioned to absorb, evaluate, and transmit knowledge across cultural boundaries. Their wealth and autonomy shielded them. Their vows protected them. Their secrecy preserved them. For a time. Then came the suppression. In 1307, the Templars were abruptly arrested, accused of heresy, and dismantled by the combined forces of the French crown and the papacy. Their records vanished. Their leadership was executed or silenced. Once again, a powerful institution connected to Eastern knowledge and alternative authority was erased through coordinated silence. The pattern is unmistakable. Merovingians, Templars, same accusations, same methods, same outcome. Both were accused not of rebellion, but of illegitimacy, of operating outside sanctioned authority, of possessing knowledge that bypassed institutional control, and both disappear without their secrets being fully explained. This is where Eastern Crusader states become crucial. When the Templars fell, not all of them were captured. Some fled eastward again. Some entered other orders. Some disappeared into regions already accustomed to sheltering forbidden memory. If Merovingian descendants or traditions had survived in the East, the Crusades may have functioned as a moment of reconnection. Western Europe unknowingly brushing against its own displaced past. The shock of recognition, partial, confused, dangerous, may explain the urgency with which Rome and European monarchs moved to suppress what followed. Knowledge that survives too long becomes visible again, and visibility invites destruction. Even Grail legends intensify after the Crusades. Stories of lost kings, sacred blood, wounded rulers, and hidden lineages flood European imagination. These stories are not triumphalist. They are melancholic. They speak of something once held, then lost, then glimpsed again, never fully reclaimed. This emotional tone matters. It suggests not invention, but memory distorted by distance. The Templars may have acted as conduits rather than creators, bringing fragments of displaced tradition back to Europe, where it could no longer exist openly. Once again, story replaces doctrine. Myth replaces genealogy. Romance replaces record. History becomes safer when it pretends to be fiction. Yet the Church's reaction reveals fear rather than amusement. The suppression of the Templars was ruthless, unprecedented, and excessive. Empires do not annihilate harmless organizations. They annihilate threats. And threats, in this context, are rarely military. They are ideological. If the Templars carried whispers of sacred kingship independent of papal sanction, ideas once embodied by the Merovingians, the threat would have been existential. It would undermine the very foundation of medieval European order. Thus, the echo fades, but not completely. Just as with the Merovingians, the Templars leave behind silence filled with questions. Their treasure is never found. Their knowledge is never fully described. Their disappearance is explained, but never resolved. This repetition is the key. It suggests continuity across centuries. A lineage of ideas, not necessarily of people, moving east and west as conditions allow, appearing briefly when tolerated, disappearing swiftly when threatened. The Crusades did not recover the past. They disturbed it. And in doing so, they revealed that Europe's forgotten bloodlines and suppressed knowledge had never been destroyed, only relocated. Preserved in the East, guarded by cultures that did not fear sacred ancestry, and re-encountered only when Europe was powerful enough to travel, but not wise enough to remember. The Merovingians may not have returned as kings, but their echoes returned as questions. And questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. They linger, like the memory of a truth glimpsed at the edge of history, then lost again, waiting for a time when silence will no longer be enough to contain them. When all the fragments are finally placed side by side, when the silences, migrations, symbols, and suppressions are viewed not as isolated events, but as parts of a single pattern, the Merovingian story resolves into something far more unsettling than the fall of a dynasty. What emerges is not failure, but intent. Not collapse, but strategy. The Merovingians did not lose history. They stepped out of it. This is the revelation that lies beneath every earlier section. From the beginning, the Merovingians were never meant to function like ordinary rulers. Their power was not administrative, territorial, or even militaristic in a modern sense. It was custodial. They guarded something inherited from a world that predated Rome, predated papal Christianity, and perhaps even predated Europe's understanding of itself. When that world became incompatible with the structures rising around them, the Merovingians did not resist openly. They withdrew. Withdrawal, in this context, was not surrender. It was preservation. Everything about their disappearance supports this interpretation. Dynasties that fall accidentally leave chaos. Dynasties that are destroyed leave blood. The Merovingians left neither. They left silence, precise, coordinated, and enduring. Silence enforced by monasteries. Silence enabled by symbolic depowering rather than execution. Silence sustained by eastward movement into cultures capable of absorbing them without exposure. This kind of disappearance requires foresight. It requires the understanding that power cycles, that institutions rise and fall, and that survival sometimes depends on stepping outside the spotlight rather than fighting within it. The Merovingians appear to have understood something few ruling houses ever do, that the greatest threat to ancient knowledge is not defeat, but visibility. Once something becomes visible, it can be named. Once named, it can be defined. Once defined, it can be controlled or destroyed. The Merovingians avoided this fate by becoming unnameable. Their sacred kingship was incompatible with a church that claimed exclusive authority over divine legitimacy. Their bloodline-based authority threatened a system that needed power to flow downward from institution to individual. Their symbolic worldview conflicted with an emerging order built on written law, centralized doctrine, and standardized belief. Confrontation would have been catastrophic. Instead, they chose continuity without confrontation. By relocating eastward into Byzantium, the Caucasus, Persia, they entered civilizations that still understood the value of custodianship. In these cultures, guardianship of memory was not confused with rebellion. Sacred lineage did not automatically imply political ambition. Knowledge could exist without demanding dominance. This allowed the Merovingians to become what they may have always been, keepers rather than rulers. Seen through this lens, every later echo makes sense. Grail lore does not describe conquest. It describes worthiness. Maps do not show destinations. They show thresholds. Temporal legends do not celebrate power. They mourn loss and seek restoration. Monastic silences do not indicate ignorance. They indicate restraint. The Merovingians were not erased because they were dangerous rebels. They were erased because they represented an alternative framework for understanding authority itself. That framework never died. It moved underground, eastward, into story, ritual, lineage, and symbol. It survived in places that Western history refused to look. And when fragments of it resurfaced, during the Crusades, in Grail romances, in esoteric traditions, it was immediately neutralized, reframed as fiction, or violently suppressed. Because even distorted memory can destabilize power. The true climactic revelation, then, is not about a single bloodline surviving into the present. It is about something more profound. The survival of an idea that history tried to outgrow but never fully replaced. The idea that authority is not granted but embodied. The idea that legitimacy flows through continuity, not endorsement. The idea that kingship, whether literal or symbolic, is a responsibility to maintain balance, not a right to command. This idea is incompatible with modern systems just as it was incompatible with medieval ones. And that is why it remains buried. The Merovingians did not carry treasure eastward. They did not hide a throne. They did not plan a dramatic return. They carried a worldview, a way of understanding power that could not survive in the age that followed them. By becoming custodians instead of claimants, they ensured that this worldview would not be destroyed, only displaced. This reframes everything we think we know about forgotten history. Forgotten does not mean lost. It means set aside. Custodianship requires patience measured not in years, but in centuries. It requires accepting obscurity as the price of survival. It requires allowing the world to move on while ensuring that something essential remains intact beneath the surface. The Merovingians appear to have made that choice consciously. Their silence was not defeat. It was discipline. And the East, so often portrayed as Europe's opposite, was not an escape. It was a vault, a place where ancient patterns of kingship, memory, and sacred authority could persist without provoking annihilation. When later Europe brushed against these patterns again, it reacted with fear rather than recognition. The suppression of the Templars, the ridicule of Grail bloodline theories, the marginalization of Eastern Christian traditions, all are symptoms of a civilization uncomfortable with what it had buried. The Merovingians did not haunt Europe because they wanted to return. They haunted because they reminded of a path not taken, a path where power was symbolic rather than bureaucratic, where lineage carried responsibility rather than entitlement, where knowledge was guarded because it was dangerous, not because it was false. This is why their story refuses to close cleanly. It does not end with a coronation or a death. It dissolves into movement, silence, and echo. It becomes a question rather than a conclusion. And perhaps that is the final act of custodianship, to leave behind not answers, but a tension that never fully resolves. A reminder that history is not a straight line, but a layered structure, where what appears forgotten may simply be waiting beneath the surface, protected by time itself. The Merovingians did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because they understood what was coming. And they chose survival over spectacle, memory over monument, and continuity over crown. That choice changed the shape of history, not by altering what was written, but by determining what would never be allowed to be written at all.